All right, we are back with a new video, and today I'll be giving my personal thoughts on the Circle season 4 now that it has wrapped up. And I found this season to be all right. Now, I wouldn't say it was as good as season 3, which I would consider the best season of the Circle US so far. However, it wasn't a terrible season, or at least not an exceptionally bad season. I just feel like it was another season of the Circle, which, while not terrible, also leaves a bit to be desired. But as usual with these reviews, I like to divide them up into four sections, one being for the cast, one being for production decisions, one for being editing and presentation, and finally for gameplay. But without further ado, let's get right into the video. So first up, we have the cast. And on the whole, this largely felt like your typical Circle cast with a lot of pretty big personalities, or at least people that like to bring it a little bit extra to the show, although not as bad as what we got in say season 1 or even season 2, but it was still present nonetheless. Even so, there were definitely people that I liked. I mean, Frank was a pretty likable character. Rachel was someone that grew on me over time. Nathan was pretty interesting as he was often a very strategic player and really tried to bring something strategic to the table. I also like Trevor, of course. I mean, although to be fair, a lot of that's because like he was the person that Delisa played as a catfish back in season 2. So I feel like a lot of it was due to that. But even aside from that, Trevor was an all right character on the whole. John, also known as Carol, brought quite a bit to the table. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of Dr. Will from Big Brother. However, not as good strategically, to where he obviously made himself a pretty big target pretty early on. Then from there had his downfall. Brew had his moments. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of him coming in, but I liked his moments of self awareness, particularly as the season went on. So that was something. And that's pretty much it for the characters that I like. I mean, Yu Ling, of course, being the winner, was another character who wasn't the biggest personality in the world. It's certainly not my favorite, but she still brought a lot of positivity to the show with her getting to talk about her Chinese heritage and being good representation for the show. Although she did get into a couple squabbles here and there, she is a pretty likable winner. Now, admittedly, there are a couple other characters that I didn't really care as much about. I mean, Parker, also known as Paul, was pretty boring and also was pretty bad at the game. Krissa was a largely boring figure. I mean, she seems nice enough, but she didn't really bring much entertainment wise. And Everson was someone who could have been a big character, but with him being a late entry and never really finding his footing in the game, he didn't really do much for me. And I felt like he just got kind of overshadowed by Trevor. So on the whole, I mean, I felt like this was a pretty typical Circle cast, all things considered. I even mentioned Emma and Mel for the Spice Girls, who played a catfish called Jared. And considering I don't even know the Spice Girls, I mean, admittedly, this reference doesn't really click with me as well. I mean, they were fine on TV presences, but on the whole, they didn't click with me super well. As again, I'm not really a fan of the Spice Girls, but there's that to consider. So, all things considered, I feel like the cast was pretty good, although nothing too exceptional by Circle standards. Now we're moving on to production and format, and I feel like this was a pretty typical season as well when it comes to production side of things. Now they did introduce a couple new twists, namely Emma and Mel coming as a catfish, and then the players having to vote on who they thought was the Spice Girls, with the prize being an additional $50,000 to the prize pool when it's normally $100,000. And also have friend that they kind of spoiled it in the promo at the beginning of the season where they said this was going to be the biggest prize money ever at $150,000. So they kind of spoiled it there. And I also found it pretty funny when people were talking about how this extra $50,000 was such a game changer when really it's not really that much extra money. Now, to be fair, the Circle isn't nearly as long of a game as Survivor or BBUS, which have bigger cash prizes, of course, but it was still funny to see these people overreact to an extra $50,000, knowing that these other shows have bigger prizes. And in general, I felt like it was a pretty alright twist. Again, not too much suspense considering they spoiled it, but what can you do? And the other major new twist that they added was the safety chain, aka the hacker twist, in which the contestants got to handpick who to save, with the last person standing being automatically blocked. And we obviously saw this not too long ago on BB Can during the double eviction, and I felt like it worked all right here, where we got to see some interesting gameplay play out. So I felt that was a net positive for the show. And the games, for the most part, didn't do too much, although I did notice there were a couple games that really did stir the pot to a degree and allowed some interesting drama to take place. But at the end of the day, I felt like this was a largely normal production season of The Circle. And plus, you have the same old format, which I do have issues with. I do have issues with how The Circle is as a game. I mean, and I might make a separate video talking about my issues with The Circle, but for right now, I'll say that these issues are not really exceptional with to season 4. I felt like they're just general issues with the show, like how they don't have a jury system and how it's really hard to tell in the game who's going to win based on any given season. So I felt like that was an issue, but again, nothing that's exceptional to season 4. So on the whole, I felt like production was fine. I did like the new twist that they added, but on the whole, I mean, it was a largely normal season of The Circle, and while I do have something to complain about, I can't fault this season too much for having those things. Now we're moving on to editing and presentation, and in a similar line to the production section, I feel like I have tons of issues with how The Circle is presented and edited. I mean, I think one of the biggest issues in general I have with the show is the fact that they don't give us a full rating system. Now, I understand that they do it in order to create some suspense so that we don't exactly know who's going to finish where in the aggregated ratings. However, I kind of wish that they did what they do on Survivor, where they would have the full ratings at the end of every episode that have ratings so we can see how everyone rated everyone and get a sense of whether they were voting strategically and whether they were basing anything on relationships or if they were voting purely strategically. So that is a general issue I have with The Circle. That is an issue that continues with this season, but again, doesn't really make this season exceptionally worse. Now, I will also fault this season in particular for its format decisions, where I didn't like how they decided to break up the cliffhangers, where we literally had at the end of weeks 2 and 3 a cliffhanger right before a blocking, which I get. I mean, in general, I don't like the fact that The Circle is structured like a Netflix show, which is designed to encourage binge watching by literally dropping 4 episodes at a time, and they have these cliffhangers to encourage you to turn on the next episode. So I kind of understand why they tend to stop episodes in weird spots. But considering the fact that they would literally end two entire blocks, like right before we know a blocking, made it pretty annoying for me. I mean, it was annoying to wait a week just to see in the first 5 minutes of next week who got blocked. And also annoying for me making these power rankings because I literally have to relegate two people to the bottom automatically because one of them are technically the most likely to be blocked in the first 5 minutes. So I found that pretty annoying. And in turn, I think that decision ultimately hurt the pacing as well, where literally in week 2, there was only one true blocking in that entire week, while the last week, week 3, really rushed things through where they had a bunch of blockings all at once, which was pretty annoying if you ask me. Again, it really made the pacing really bizarre, where again, it felt really slow at the beginning but then they just race through the end game, which isn't ideal. And obviously is an issue I have generally with The Circle, but I feel like this season really made that problem worse. So that's not something I particularly like. And then we can talk a bit about Frank's winter edit, which I found to be pretty standard for the most part. Like, I had a pretty good sense early on that he was going to be the winner from early on, largely because he seemed to fit a similar mold to that of James for season 3, who again ultimately won that season, but also through his dominance of the game, which we'll be talking about in a moment. And I feel like the show really went out of its way to show him in a positive light. Mind you, I felt like the main thing holding me back from considering him a top winner for most of the season was the nature of the final rating system, which I felt like with Frank being so dominant in the game that I worried that he was going to be downvoted in the final rating, making sure that he doesn't win. And that was a big reason why I also brought up people like Yu Ling and Rachel, as they are people who have plenty of connections in the game, but were ultimately people who weren't going to be seen as big of a threat compared to Frank and might have been upvoted as a result. But ultimately, again, they kind of surprised me there with giving Frank the win at the end of the day, which is pretty satisfying, but it also made it for a pretty unpredictable season, all things considered. So, on the whole, I felt like, again, the editing style was largely similar to that of previous seasons, although I found the pacing and the breakup of the episodes a bit worse in this season compared to other seasons, where I felt like the pacing, again, was too slow at the beginning, too fast at the end, and I didn't like how they ended batches of episodes right before a blocking. So those are my thoughts on the editing. And then finally, we can talk a bit about the gameplay this season, which I know The Circle isn't as interesting of a game as other shows like Survivor, Big Brother, and that it's really hard to tell sometimes who is going to come out on top given the final rating system, whether people are voting strategically or whether they're voting purely based on their relationships. However, I feel like this season did present itself with a good gameplay where obviously we had some pretty big players, particularly people like John and Nathan really playing strategically, although I don't feel like they were playing exceptionally well. Where Carol had such a major issue with threat management to where literally by the middle of week 2, everyone knew that they were a catfish. Now, mind you, I did kind of like the fact that we heard people like Brew actively saying that they didn't care that Carol was a catfish, but still ultimately blocked them due to being such a big threat. And then you have Nathan, who literally spends every blocking. Like we hear his explanations of how he's voting strategically, which was interesting in the sense that he was a super duper fan of these social strategy games, but it also led to some pretty bad gameplay, especially like during the round where he was trying to throw Brew under the bus. Brew was literally his closest ally and someone that would have upvoted him in the final rating. But for whatever reason, because Brew was at the bottom, he just decides to completely throw him under the bus, goes into complete self preservation mode, and then it ultimately backfires when he can't even save himself after Brew goes out the door. So there's that. Now, on the flip side, I think we have some people playing pretty well. Like, it was interesting seeing Trevor play pretty well, all things considered, where he's obviously only eligible in 2 ratings, and him getting 4th place in his first rating and then the final rating getting 2nd place was pretty impressive. And then we have Frank, the winner, who I felt like played an extremely dominant game, literally getting first on every single rating, with the exception of the second one. But even then, he got third. So even then, it was a very impressive display. And despite him being seen as his big threat, I mean, no one really wanted to downvote him the entire season. And then by the end, like he had people voting for him to win, not really caring that he was such a big threat, causing him to win. So I found that to be pretty interesting as well, and ultimately led to a pretty satisfying winner. And on the flip side, again, you have plenty of good gameplay throughout the season, but also some pretty bad gameplay as well. So I feel like at the end of the day, it did kind of level out, and it was moderately amusing. Although compared to other shows like Survivor, Big Brother, I wouldn't call it overly amazing either. So to wrap up my thoughts on the Circle US, I feel like it was a pretty fine season, all things considered. Like, it certainly could have been worse for what they were given, but I feel like they largely managed to remain consistent compared to other US seasons. And while it was a downgrade over season 3, I felt like it was still pretty good for The Circle at least. But compared to other shows, like I don't enjoy The Circle as much as those other shows, and I wish there were things about it that they would fix. However, I feel like that may be a topic for another video, so if I end up making that, stay tuned for that. But it still had plenty of pros. Like I felt like it had an alright cast, and I felt like it led to a very satisfying winner, but there was enough downsides to where I wasn't overly invested in the season. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. And moving forward, I mean, we're sort of in a slow period right now where there really aren't any shows to cover. Now, I do have a couple of videos sort of to wrap up my coverage of other shows. Like, I am planning to do a player ranking of this show next week. There's also the player ranking for Survivor. But then after that, like, I probably will be releasing some more general videos. And I know there's plenty of exciting stuff really between now and when Big Brother starts in July. So stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.